The Ukraine war has devastated countless lives, reshaped global alliances, and sent shockwaves through the world economy. But why do some blame the United States for the conflict? From geopolitics to military influence, let's explore 10 reasons why the US is seen as the major key player in this war. 1. NATO expansion. NATO's eastward expansion is one of the most polarizing issues in the discourse surrounding the Ukraine war. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO began incorporating former Warsaw Pact members like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Later, Baltic nations such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also joined. This expansion pushed NATO's presence right up to Russia's borders. Russia perceived this as a violation of verbal agreements made during the dissolution of the USSR, where Western leaders allegedly assured Moscow that NATO would not expand eastward. Moscow views NATO's enlargement as a direct threat to its security, especially given NATO's collective defense clause, which binds all member states to defend one another in the event of an attack. This significantly reduces Russia's strategic buffer zones. As NATO's leading force, the US was instrumental in the expansion efforts, providing political, financial, and military support to new member states. The potential inclusion of Ukraine into NATO was a red line for Russia, which feared losing its influence over the country and further encirclement by NATO forces. This issue is often cited as a trigger for the 2014 Crimea annexation and the eventual full-scale invasion in 2022. 2. The 2014 Maidan Revolution. The 2014 Maidan Revolution, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, saw mass protests in Kyiv that ousted pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. The revolution was sparked by Yanukovych's decision to reject an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. High-profile US officials, including Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, openly supported the protesters and were accused of meddling in Ukraine's internal affairs. The infamous leaked call between Nuland and the US ambassador to Ukraine, where they discussed Ukraine's future government, further fueled claims of interference. Russia viewed the revolution as a US-backed coup aimed at pulling Ukraine away from Moscow's sphere of influence. This perception deepened distrust between Russia and the US, with Moscow using the event as justification for annexing Crimea and supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine. 3. Supplying weapons to Ukraine. Before the 2022 invasion, the US provided Ukraine with military aid, including Javelin anti-tank missiles and other defensive equipment. While this was meant to deter Russian aggression, critics argue it heightened tensions. Moscow interpreted US arms supplies as evidence that Ukraine was becoming a proxy for Western interests. The presence of Western weapons in Ukraine was seen as a direct challenge to Russia's military superiority in the region, further escalating the conflict. Supplying weapons to Ukraine may have emboldened Kyiv to adopt a more confrontational stance toward Russia, reducing the chances of peaceful negotiations. Critics also argue that the arms supplies played into Moscow's narrative of Western encroachment. 4. Ignoring Russia's security concerns. For years, Russia raised concerns about NATO's activities near its borders, including military exercises, missile defense systems, and troop deployments. The US and NATO maintained that these actions were defensive in nature and necessary to protect member states. However, Russia viewed them as provocations, especially when combined with discussions about NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. Critics argue that dismissing Russia's concerns left Moscow feeling increasingly isolated and cornered, contributing to its decision to escalate the conflict in Ukraine. 5. Energy politics. Energy has been a significant factor in US-Russia tensions, particularly regarding Europe's dependency on Russian gas. The US vehemently opposed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would have allowed Russia to deliver gas directly to Germany, bypassing Ukraine and reducing Kyiv's leverage. Critics argue that U.S. opposition to the pipeline was less about European energy security and more about weakening Russia's economic influence in Europe. By challenging Russia's dominance in energy markets, the U.S. may have inadvertently escalated tensions, as Moscow saw this as an economic threat to its power. 6. The U.S. role in Ukrainian politics. The U.S. has been deeply involved in Ukraine's political development since the fall of the Soviet Union, providing financial aid and supporting reforms. Russia and some critics argue that the U.S. has overstepped its bounds, shaping Ukraine's politics in a way that alienated pro-Russian factions and stoked internal divisions. U.S. support for Ukraine's pivot toward the West, including EU integration, was seen by Moscow as a direct challenge to its influence. 7. Promoting a proxy war narrative. Some analysts argue that the Ukraine war is less about defending Ukrainian sovereignty and more about weakening Russia. The extensive U.S. military aid and sanctions against Russia have led critics to believe that the U.S. is using Ukraine as a battleground to exhaust Russian resources and diminish its global influence. Russia has also framed the conflict as a Western plot to destabilize it, further escalating hostilities. 8. Sanctions and economic isolation. The U.S. imposed heavy sanctions on Russia following its 2014 annexation of Crimea and escalated them further after the 2022 invasion. Sanctions targeted key sectors of Russia's economy, including energy, finance, and defense. While intended to deter aggression, they also deepened Russia's economic struggles and heightened tensions. Critics argue that sanctions pushed Russia closer to China and other adversaries of the U.S., potentially creating a more dangerous geopolitical alignment. 9. Media and public opinion. The U.S. media has played a major role in shaping the narrative around the Ukraine war, often focusing on Russia's aggression while downplaying America's role in the conflict. Critics argue that the U.S.-led narratives oversimplify the complex history of the region, portraying Russia as the sole aggressor and ignoring legitimate security concerns. This one-sided framing fuels anti-Russian sentiment, making diplomacy more difficult. 10. Undermining diplomacy. Despite calls for a negotiated settlement, critics claim the U.S. has prioritized military solutions over diplomacy. Some believe the U.S. could have pushed harder for diplomatic solutions before the invasion, addressing Russia's concerns while maintaining Ukraine's sovereignty. Critics argue that by focusing on arming Ukraine, the U.S. made peace talks less likely, prolonging the conflict. The Ukraine war is a complex and tragic conflict, and blame is rarely simple. While Russia's actions have been condemned globally, the U.S. faces criticism for its role in shaping the events that led to this devastating war. What do you think? Is America responsible, or are these accusations unfair? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the biggest issues shaping our world. Until next time, this is Innovatronics TV. See you in the next video.